This is a Dutch testing report tutorial. This is to assist you with just understanding Dutch testing results. This video is for educational information only and not to be taken as medical advice. The results that we're showing on the screen are just a set of results to move the conversation along. They're not from any actual patient results. When we're looking at all of the data that we have for cortisol, the primary bit of information that we want to look at is the free cortisol pattern. Firstly, so we've got 4 different measurements. We've got the waking cortisol, which tells you the cortisol exposure during the nighttime, and then those first 2 hours of the day where the cortisol's usually hopping up quite a bit. That's that morning sample, 2 hours after waking. Then there's another one around dinner time, which tells you the late afternoon cortisol, and then one around bedtime, which is usually the lowest. So what we do is we make the 4 measurements, we add them up, so that gives you this value here. That gives you the total for free cortisol. In this case, those are either normal or elevated, somewhere on the upper side of the total there. Now that's free cortisol, but if we want to look at the total production, typically we're looking at metabolized cortisol because that represents not just 1% like the free cortisol, but it's really a better marker for overall production because it represents about 75%. So in this particular case, the cortisol production is either on the low side or within range. So what's complicated about this situation is that the patient's taking cortisol, hydrocortisone or cortisol, presumably orally. So when you get that situation, it gets complex because you really need to inquire with the patient and see when they took the cortisol compared to when they took the samples. Okay, so we've got a lot more data that we can look at as well. Just generally the basics on cortisol. Cortisol is usually made by the adrenal gland, although in this case they may have taken it. And it converts to cortisone, and it's back and forth with cortisol and cortisone. There's an enzyme that mediates that conversion called 11-beta HSD. So it's back and forth. So because it's back and forth throughout the day, it's good to confirm that pattern of free cortisol by looking also at cortisone. Okay, and there are a couple different ways this test can be done. You can either take the cortisol right after that waking sample, in which case this morning sample should be a good reflection of the morning exposure to the cortisol from the supplement, right? Or you can not take the supplement when you wake up, and then the morning sample is more of a reflection of their endogenous self-produced cortisol. And either one of those can be interesting information and useful information, but you need to know what they did in terms of understanding the results properly. So the cortisol goes back and forth, cortisol to cortisone, then it's metabolized down to cortisol and cortisone metabolites, and again that becomes your better marker of overall production of cortisol. And do keep in mind that those metabolites are typically going to be elevated more than maybe makes sense when you're on the cortisol. Meaning if I take cortisol at 8 a.m., I'm going to see those metabolites about noon, right? But a lot of the cortisol is going to go from my mouth to my gut, and it's going to get turned in my gut from cortisol to a cortisol metabolite. A great degree of it is. If that happens in the gut, that cortisol has never been in circulation as free cortisol. So in that case, if you're on the cortisol at the time of testing, these metabolites may be more of an elevated value than is reality in terms of how much cortisol is actually circulating. So again, with supplementation of cortisol, it's a complex situation. You want to look at free cortisol over time, the total of the metabolites, right? And then also the information about when they took the cortisol. Some information on cortisol production. Usually when we're looking at cortisol production relative to free cortisol, it can imply something about the cortisol metabolism, that if the cortisol metabolism is upregulated, it can be due to obesity, it can be due to high thyroid. In a case like this, you've got to be careful with the interpretation, because if you take the cortisol and it ends up sort of artificially, to a degree, increasing those metabolites, you can get this picture of increased cortisol production, or a clearance, excuse me, when it's not really happening. because, again, of this gut metabolism of the cortisol. So again, it's a complex situation. At the bottom, you can see your best marker for overall predominance of either cortisol or cortisone metabolites. So you'll want to look at which way that's pointing to see which is predominating systemically, either the cortisol or the cortisone. But again, always putting this information in the proper context of knowing that at some point that patient is taking cortisol supplementation. So I hope that's been helpful. If you have any questions from a patient perspective, please do see your healthcare provider for those, and we thank you for testing with us.